She arrived at the mining settlement with 11 cents and a dress that had not been clean in 2 weeks. The street was mud and timber and the smell of men who worked underground. A row of buildings leaned into each other like they were tired. At the far end, a mule stood, hitched to nothing in particular. She stopped in front of the boarding house. A man was sweeping the porch, not lazily but with attention, working the bristles into the corners. He had not looked up yet. She looked at the 11 cents in her palm. Then she closed her hand. He looked up. She said, "I can cook and clean, sir." He set the broom against the railing. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he is trying to place. Not unkindly, but without any hurry to decide. The morning was cold. Her breath showed. "You have experience?" She kept her hands at her sides. "Yes, sir." He looked at the street behind her briefly, then back. "Where?" She told him. A household before. A good one, with a real kitchen and a wood stove and a woman who had taught her to put up preserves and render lard and bake bread that held together. The household had broken up after the mistress died, and she had not waited to see what came next. She did not say more than that, and he did not ask. He picked the broom back up and finished the corner he had been working on, and she stood on the street and waited and did not fidget, because fidgeting was something she had trained out of herself a long time ago, when she understood that stillness reads as competence, whether or not you feel it. He opened the door and held it. "Your name is?" "Jane Porter, sir." "The woman who cooked here left 2 weeks ago. Meals at 6 and noon. Your room is at the back." She walked in. He showed her the room, a narrow bed, a hook on the wall, a window that faced the alley. Then he set some coins on the sill and looked at the window instead of at her. "General store is 2 buildings down. Ask for the woman there. Tell her you need a working dress. She keeps some ready-made on a peg near the back." He paused. "Can't have you serving meals like that." She looked at the coins. She picked them up. "I'll be back before supper," she said. He nodded and left her to it. The woman at the general store had the look of someone who had sized up a great many people in a great many conditions and did not find any of it remarkable. She looked at Jane for a moment, then moved to the back of the store without being asked. She lifted a plain dress from the peg, dark gray, sturdy cotton, cut for work rather than occasion, and held it up briefly. "You're at the boarding house," the woman said. It was not a question. "Yes, ma'am." The woman added a heavy apron from the hook beside it and set both on the counter. She said the gray would hold up through the winter, and that she had a second one in brown if she came back when she had more coin. She said it the way a person says something they have said many times before, not unkindly, just with the efficiency of someone who understood what was actually needed and saw no reason to dress it up. Jane paid what was asked. She had a few coins left over. She folded the dress and apron over her arm and walked back up the street. The boarding house had 8 men staying in it, miners mostly, and one who called himself a surveyor, though his instruments rarely left his room. They ate in shifts. They were not unkind to her, but they watched her the way men watch something new in a room they have occupied a long time, with a wariness that had nothing to do with her personally and everything to do with the fact of her. Daniel Harper ran the house without waste. He kept accounts in a ledger he left open on the desk, which she took to mean he had nothing to hide. He gave instructions once and did not repeat them, which suited her because she did not need things repeated. She was up before him the first morning. The fire was already lit and the coffee was on, and she was cutting salt pork at the block when she heard his boots on the stairs. A particular sound, unhurried, 2 steps from the bottom heavier than the rest, because that was where the tread gave slightly. She did not turn around. She heard him stop in the doorway, take in the room, the fire, the coffee, the smell of the meat going in the pan, and then heard him pull out the chair and sit down, and neither of them said anything, and that was fine. The men noticed within 2 days. The biscuits were the thing that did it, made the way her mother had taught her, with lard worked cold into the flour until it was right, and they came out with a layered quality that the men recognized as something they had not had in some time. One of them pushed back from the table and looked at the ceiling as though doing a calculation. "Better than my mother's." 2 others turned on him immediately. She kept her back to all of them and worked the pan and did not smile until she was facing the wall. And by the time she turned around, her expression was ordinary again. Daniel was watching from the far end of the table. When she met his eye, he looked back down at his cup, and she looked away, and that was the first thing that passed between them that neither of them had intended. It was a week before he asked her anything that was not about the house. He came in from the stable yard. It was nearly dark, the temperature dropping fast the way it did in that country, and she was at the stove. He crossed to the basin and washed his hands and dried them and hung the cloth back on the nail. Without turning around, he said, "You have family to write to." It was not quite a question. She moved the spoon in the pot. Her parents had gone the previous spring, she said. Fever. Her father first, and then her mother, inside the same week, as though her mother had decided there was no point continuing without him. She said it evenly, the way you say a thing when the sharpest edge of it has worn down from being handled, not because it hurts less, but because you have made a kind of peace with carrying it. He stood with his back to her a moment longer than necessary. She understood that he was giving her the courtesy of not watching her face. He turned and took his coat from the hook and folded it over the back of a chair and sat down. A long moment passed. The fire, the pot, the last gray light going out of the window. "I'm sorry for it," he said. She moved the spoon and said she was grateful for that, and there was a particular texture to the silence after, not uncomfortable but full, the way a room feels when something real has been said in it and no one has tried to cover it over. She did not reach for more words, and neither did he, and she found she was glad of that, more glad than she could have explained, and she did not try. The days arranged themselves into a shape she recognized. She knew how to live inside a house that needed tending, knew the rhythm of it, the particular satisfaction of a swept floor and a restocked larder and a fire that caught on the first try. The mountains were visible from the kitchen window, snow on the peaks already, and it was not yet deep into the season. She watched them in the mornings while the coffee came up and let herself think about nothing in particular, which was its own kind of rest, the first real rest she had had since the spring. One evening in October, he came in from the stable yard, moving carefully, favoring his left side. Something wrenched in his shoulder from the look of it, the way he held his arm close and did not swing it. He did not say anything about it. He crossed to the basin and washed his hands, and came to the table and sat down and opened the ledger, as though nothing was different, except that he turned the pages with his right hand only, and his jaw was set in the particular way of a man managing discomfort he has decided not to mention. She watched this for a moment from the stove. Then she took the liniment from the shelf and set it on the table beside him without comment. He looked at it. He looked at her. She had already turned back to the stove. He was quiet for a moment. Then she heard the sound of the bottle being unstoppered. "Thank you," he said. She moved the pot on the hook and said it was on the shelf if he needed it again, and that was all either of them said about it. But the kitchen felt different after, warmer somehow, or closer. And when she glanced at the window, a little later the reflection showed her own face, and she looked away from it quickly and kept her hands busy and was grateful again for the noise of the pot. His coffee cup moved, over the weeks, from the far end of the table to the near end. Not all at once. Gradually, the way a current moves something without announcing it. She noticed and said nothing. She began setting it there when she laid the table in the mornings, and he sat down without comment. The ledger work he used to do in the office he began bringing to the kitchen table in the evenings. She would be mending or working her own accounts, and he would sit across from her with the ledger open, and sometimes one of them would say something practical about the provisions, the schedule, the state of the roof. And the other would answer, and then the quiet would come back. And it was a different quality of quiet than it had been at the beginning. One night, he looked up from the ledger and watched her thread a needle, watched her hold the thread to the lamp and ease it through the eye on the second try, and said without particular intention, "My mother used to do that the same way." She looked up. He had already looked back down at the ledger. A muscle in his jaw moved once. She threaded the needle and began her work, and did not say anything, because there was nothing to say that would improve on what he had just, without meaning to, told her. That evening she made a pie from the dried apples she had been saving. She set it on the table after supper without announcement, and went back to the kitchen, and she heard a few minutes later the particular sound of men who have been given something they did not expect. Daniel came to the kitchen doorway. He stood there a moment. She was washing the pan. "That was well done," he said. She kept her hands in the water. "It needed using." He went back to the table. She listened to the sounds from the other room and found that her hands in the warm water were entirely still. Mr. Sherman came on a Thursday in the middle of the noon meal. He was not a large man, but he moved like one, like he expected the room to make space, and the room generally did. He had a good coat and hard eyes, the kind that were always measuring something. He came in without knocking, and pulled out a chair at the table without being invited, and sat with the ease of a man who has never needed an invitation anywhere. Jane was at the sideboard. She kept her back to the room and stacked the plates with quiet hands. Mr. Sherman wanted the 2 front rooms held on rotation for his crew. Men coming up from the shaft who needed beds and meals settled through the mine office at quarter's end. He laid it out as though explaining something self-evident to someone who had not yet caught up. He said the boarding house did well because of the mine, and it was only reasonable to expect some accommodation. He said other houses in the territory had found the arrangement agreeable. Daniel listened. He did not interrupt, and his face did not change. When Mr. Sherman finished, the room was quiet. One of the miners at the far end of the table looked at his plate. Daniel set his cup down. "I run this house on settled accounts." Mr. Sherman smiled, the particular smile of a man who believes patience is a form of dominance. He spread his hands on the table. "That's a fine principle for ordinary times." Daniel looked at him steadily. "These are ordinary times." Mr. Sherman turned then and looked at Jane. "The way you look at a piece of furniture you have not decided whether to move," and then looked back. The smile went flat. He pushed back his chair and stood and buttoned his coat with the deliberateness of a man performing composure. "The company remembers its friends come spring." Daniel picked his cup back up. "I hope so." Mr. Sherman understood that nothing further was coming. He left without another word, not slamming the door because he was too careful for that, and the room held the shape of him for a moment after he was gone. Jane picked up the remaining plates. Her hands were steady. She carried them into the kitchen and set them in the basin, and stood with her hands in the water, which was still warm, and breathed slowly until the thing in her chest eased. She had known men like Mr. Sherman. She knew the particular quality of being looked at, the way he had looked at her, as something incidental, in the margin of a more important conversation. It did not surprise her, and it did not undo her. What moved through her slowly, the way heat moves through a room, was the quality of Daniel's refusal, not anger, not performance. Just a man who knew what was his and was willing to say so plainly and bear whatever followed. She dried her hands. She went back to work. Winter came down off the mountain in earnest and changed the character of the house. The men stayed in longer, crowded the common room through the evenings with their card games and their arguments and their laughter that went on past the point of the joke. She moved through it without friction, refilling cups, banking the fire before bed, and the mornings remained hers. In those early hours, the house settled into a different version of itself, smaller and slower, lit by the fire and whatever pale light came off the snow through the windows. She worked the kitchen, and Daniel worked the ledger at the nearby table, and outside the wind came off the mountain and moved on. He had started leaving things for her. A new paring knife on the kitchen block one morning, better balanced than the one she had been using. A shawl folded over the back of her chair the day the cold came through the walls. Thick wool, dark green, not new but well kept, smelling faintly of cedar. She put it around her shoulders without comment. She used the knife without comment. She understood that comment was not what he was after. One morning, deep in December, he came down to find her mending at the kitchen table, the lamp still lit because the sun was not yet up. He poured his coffee and sat down across from her, close, not at the far end the way he used to, and opened the ledger and worked his figures, and she worked her mending, and the fire crackled, and the wind hit the side of the house, and the lamp burned low between them. After a while he said, without looking up, "You were up before the fire this morning." She kept her needle moving. "Couldn't sleep." He turned a page. The fire shifted in the grate. "The roof over the back room wants looking at," he said. "Come spring." "I noticed," she said. He nodded and went back to his figures. She went back to her mending. What passed between them in that hour was not words, was not anything either of them could have named, but it was real, and they both knew it, and neither of them reached for it directly, because some things are fragile in proportion to how much they matter, and neither of them was careless. The question came on a morning in January, arriving the way the most important things arrive, which is plainly between one moment and the next, without ceremony. She was at the table. He came down the stairs with the particular weight of a man who has made up his mind, and she could hear it in his step before she saw his face. He crossed to the stove and poured his coffee and stood there with his back to her for a moment. Then he came to the table and sat down across from her and folded his hands on the surface in front of him and looked at them. She kept her needle moving. She waited. He looked up. "I think you should stay on. Permanently." A pause. Brief. Considered. "As my wife, if that suits you." The needle in her hand was still. The fire moved in the grate. Outside, a horse shifted in the cold, and its shoe rang once against the frozen ground, and then there was silence again. He kept his eyes on her, not pressing, just steady. She set the mending on the table. She looked at him for a long moment, at the set of his jaw and the patience in his face, and the hands folded in front of him, the right one still faintly marked where the cut had healed. And then she stood and crossed to the window and stood with her back to the room, looking at the mountains and the pale early light coming up over the ridge. He waited. She turned around. She crossed back to the table and stood beside him and held out her hand. Open, palm up, the way you offer something you have decided to stop holding on to alone. He looked at it. He took it in both of his. She looked down at their hands and then up at him. "Yes," she said, quietly. "The way you say a thing you have known for some time and are only now allowed to put into words." The fire burned. The house ticked and settled around them. Down the hall, one of the boarders turned in his bunk, and outside the settlement was already starting its day. Boots on frozen ground, a door, the ring of iron somewhere in the cold, and the world went on, ordinary and sufficient, with the two of them inside it. The girl arrived in the autumn, 3 years on, with difficulty, and then suddenly, and then there she was, and the difficulty was beside the point. Jane sat in the chair by the hearth with the child against her chest. The baby was warm and specific and already entirely herself. Her breathing the small, even breathing of someone who has arrived somewhere and found it acceptable. Jane held her and listened to the house, to Daniel moving quietly on the other side of the room, to the fire, to the settlement outside doing what it always did in the evening, which was wind down slowly, voices going quiet, horses settling, the far ring of something metal, and then nothing. Daniel brought the low stool beside her chair and sat. He reached out and touched the back of the baby's hand with one finger. Carefully, the way you are with something that has already proven itself worth keeping. The lamp was low. Outside the settlement made its ordinary sounds. A door somewhere, a horse, people who worked hard and slept hard and would rise before the sun, because the work required it. Jane looked at the fire. She felt the small chest rising and falling against her own, that particular rhythm, new and already necessary. And she listened to Daniel breathing beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, and she did not try to name what she felt. Some things are too large for naming. Naming them only makes them smaller. The wind came down off the mountain and moved around the house, around the timber walls and the good fire and the two of them and the child between them, and went on into the dark. The fire burned. The world continued. And that, ladies and gentlemen, was the story of Jane, who arrived at a mining settlement with nothing but a dirty dress and a few coins in her hand, and never left. Let me know in the comments if you like this one. As always, thank you.